Good evening, and welcome to Art After Dark at Norton from Home. I'm Glenn Tomlinson, William Randolph Hearst Curator of Education at the Norton Museum of Art, and it's my pleasure to introduce our guests who will be in tonight's conversation, Robert Rauschenberg, an oral history. Sara Sinclair is an oral historian of Cree Ojibwa, German Jewish, and British descent. Sara teaches in the Oral History Master's Program at Columbia University. She's contributed to the Columbia Center for Oral History Research's COVID-19 Oral History Narrative and Memory Archive, Obama Presidency Oral History, and Robert Rauschenberg Oral History Project. With Peter Behrman and Mary Marshall Clark, Sinclair edited Robert Rauschenberg, An Oral History, published by Columbia University Press in the spring of 2019. Prior to attending Columbia University's Oral History MA program, Sara lived in Ethiopia, where she conducted an oral history project for the International Labor Organization. And her thesis at Columbia University consisted of interviews exploring the narratives of university-educated, reservation-raised Native North Americans on returning to their nations after school. Sara expanded this project, How We Go Home, Voices from Indigenous North America, through Voice of Witnesses Story Lab. Our second guest is Donald Saff, an artist, art historian, and educator. Among his many honors, he was awarded a Fulbright Fellowship to Italy. And in 1968, Saff founded the printmaking workshop Graphic Studio at the University of South Florida in Tampa, where he also served as distinguished professor and chair of the Visual Arts Department, as well as founding dean of the College of Fine Arts. In the early 1970s and again in the early 1990s, Saff worked with Robert Rauschenberg on numerous experimental print projects. In the years in between, Saff served as artistic director for the Rauschenberg Overseas Culture Interchange, or ROCI, between 1984 and 91. This project epitomized Rauschenberg's belief in the power of art as a catalyst for positive social change. Saff's artistic collaborations with leading late 20th century artists are the subject of a recent book, Donald Saff, Art in Collaboration, by Marilyn Kushner. Here to lead our conversation tonight is Cheryl Brutvan, the Norton Museum of Art's Director of Curatorial Affairs and the Bailey Curator of Contemporary Art. Cheryl, welcome.
Thank you, Glenn. And I'm so happy that we can welcome our guest tonight and speak further about Robert Rauschenberg. We're having a terrific moment about Rauschenberg here at the Norton Museum, since we have an exhibit, 5 Decades from the Whitney's collection, that has allowed us to actually consider him in depth. And as I started researching Robert Rauschenberg, although he's a contemporary master, we all know him, it seems like one of the books, I think really the book I found most enjoyable and fascinating to read was Sara's oral history. And it was really remarkable and insightful and brought Robert Rauschenberg to life, which not all art history does. So there's a big difference with oral history, it seems. And just also to say to Donald Saff, whose work I know even from before coming to Florida, I knew of Graphic Studio and prints and drawings from my previous career at the Albright Knox, but also your book on printmaking. So I'm very, very happy that we are both here and to be able to really bring Rauschenberg to life again through this conversation that hopefully is bringing up even more information that may be published. So I thought, just as a quick, you can say hello, both of you.
Hi. Great. Thank you for having us.
So, and this, keep it informal. But I thought, just so everyone who may be viewing or even for the life of this presentation knows of what the exhibit is here. It's done succinctly with only 19 objects, and it really does give an overview of Rauschenberg's career. So we'll just take a quick look at those images that shows our exhibition at the Norton, which will be on view and through December 6th. And we'll go to the first images of the exhibit. It's really wide-ranging. It fills the space with only 19 objects. The one work going forward. Next, the Blue Eagle, one of his combines, which is certainly one of the best known contributions of his work. I think I know when he had, or there was an exhibit at the Met that Gary Tinterow put together in 2006, Bob Rauschenberg was still alive, and he said, "What am I doing at the Met?" But it just also shows how classic his work is. And this idea of painting, sculpture, undefinable, was such a hallmark of what we associate with Rauschenberg. And again, forward thinking, this is something that is barely being accepted today, and yet here it is, 1962, when he's doing it. And next, the earlier black painting. Next, thank you. The black painting Untitled, we're thrilled that the Whitney owns this very early example, one of a very few that exist. In a film that I was able to see recently, Michael Blackwood's film on Rauschenberg, Rauschenberg said he wanted to see what not painting would look like, which is why this painting looks the way it does, with newspaper and black paint on panels. And next image. And as Don knows well in Captiva, when you became familiar with Rauschenberg, it was boxes that he was focused on, again, using what is in the world around him as a main point and main element in his work. And next, which carried through to the use of fabric after he traveled to India, and again, associated with papermaking that Don will tell us more about. Next. And this beautiful piece also dealing with minimalism on his own terms in the late 70s. When you think of what was happening with industrial materials, he does the same kind of geometry and simplicity with fabric. Next. Again, and transferring images onto fabric and a collage as well. Next. And then you see Hog Heaven, later 70s, maybe revamp of the combine concept, but a bit more finished, I think, and very bold. His materials changed slightly. Next, and another solvent transfer on fabric, Pull from the 70s. Next. And then in our last gallery, looking at the later work, one of his wonderful assemblages, Mobiloid Glut from '88, which picked up pieces from his trip to Texas. And the last painting in the exhibit, the Sphinx's Atelier, where he changes his materials for more environmentally friendly, but still has this transfer of imagery. Next. And two pieces on metal. One probably produced on copper from Chile, probably done from the ROCI experiments, as well as this later solvent transfer on metal, the manhole cover piece on the right. And then the Soviet American array in the next image, and the next image, please. This incredible series of printmaking in itself, a remarkable effort, but also this expansive view of relating Moscow, New York, art for everyone as part of the Rauschenberg Overseas Cultural Interchange. And with that kind of quick overview, I'm happy that we can have a conversation. And I think first, Sara, this idea of oral history is hard to achieve when you have no longer the artist with you and you're relying on who is here. Certainly for Rauschenberg, two of his dearest friends, Merce Cunningham and John Cage, weren't around to be able to talk to, and yet you still created, through your conversations, a remarkable sense of the personality and accomplishments of Rauschenberg. How did you even begin this project?
Well, it began with a grant from the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation. They came to Columbia University with an interest in compiling a biography of Rauschenberg. And there was a pilot project that was done, I think, for them to get a sense of what oral history might bring to their already very, very rich, very expansive library and records and archive on Rauschenberg. During that pilot project, I think it was 5 or 6 really key and central figures were interviewed, including Don Saff. And I was hired about 6 months after the completion of that pilot project. So by the time I was hired, the project had been greenlit and everybody had already learned, what was working. We'd strengthened up the team, and there was a sense of there was a greater focus going forward. So I remember I was hired, I was given about a month to do my own research. I'm not an art historian, I'm an oral historian.
That was that was one of my questions, like,
Yeah.
how did you embark on this when you, I mean, did you know who Rauschenberg was?
I did know who he was, but I mean, that's about it. I really, I didn't know very much of his work. And so thankfully that time was built into the project timeline and the project budget. And I was given just sort of free license to spend a month in the Columbia libraries, at the Rauschenberg Foundation, reading as much as I could, talking to the staff at the Rauschenberg Foundation, who are incredible resources. They really have that institutional memory. So many stories, so many helpful directions they pointed me in to sort of orient myself. And with Columbia, all of their oral history projects begin with writing a project blueprint. So that helped us to sort of focus on, okay, yes, Rauschenberg wants to do this biography of the artist. Columbia is also interested in doing a study of the artistic movements and social movements that Rauschenberg's life and work overlaps with.
Oh, okay.
So let's really draw that out, make that explicit in this project blueprint, which will kind of also address the idea that we're moving through different periods of time, and we're moving through hopefully different categories of inquiry as well.
Mm-hmm.
So the first 2 months were reading towards that blueprint and then writing that blueprint. And the first meeting that I had at the Rauschenberg Foundation was with Julia Blout and Gina Guy. And we sat in front of Julia's computer and they pulled up these huge spreadsheets of potential narrators. You know, I think there were probably like 200 individuals on those spreadsheets, all the points of contact that they believe might contribute to this.
Well, he was very popular.
Yes.
He had a lot of friends.
Yes, very social. So that was sort of how it began. It was sort of in conversation with Julia, who is the lead from the Rauschenberg Foundation, and myself, and then with David White and Gina Guy. Okay, who are the people that we're going to interview? Ultimately, we interviewed 60 narrators over a period of about 2 years. And I think we ultimately had 90 sessions. So many of our narrators were interviewed more than once. And it was a total of, I believe, 179 recorded hours of audio and sometimes videotape, sometimes 40 video sessions, which I then attempted later on to whittle down into this book. Sort of towards, one of the interesting things was we didn't have a book in mind at the outset, right?
Oh, really?
No. So we did the project, and then the director of Insight, Peter Behrman, thought that actually Columbia Center for Oral History Research would do well to produce books out of their projects. And of the ones that were currently on board at Insight, he felt like Rauschenberg made the strongest candidate for their first attempt at that. So the project was almost done when he came to me and asked, do you think there's a book in this work? And it was so clear to me that, you know, there's probably several books and a movie and, you know, all kinds of other points of access. So that was interesting, you know, to not have known while we were interviewing, then made the editing process a kind of entirely new beginning, because it wasn't like we were interviewing with this in mind.
Right. And so did you come away with a sense that you were revealing parts of Rauschenberg that people didn't know about? This was an opportunity to let more people know about who he was, what his motivations were, what his life was? I mean, is that part of the objective of an oral history?
I think the objective of an oral history, and it's, you know, I think the reason I was drawn to oral history is that it's just such a great way to learn about history. It's so accessible, you know, it's so sensory.
Well, it's very personal, though, too.
Yeah, it's very personal. And, you know, Rauschenberg in and of himself was just such an excellent subject, because people, for the most part, I mean, of course, there are moments of conflict in every relationship, but for the most part, people came into the interviews and like the second they sat down, they were laughing and smiling. You know, they were so animated. They were so happy for the opportunity, I think, to almost visit with him in a way by this retelling and this sharing. And as you said, he was a very social creature. So the stories were fun. You know, I think the sense that we get about the way that he worked was that there was always a party going on. One of our narrators said, you know, the best parties always have kids and dogs. And the parties at Rauschenberg's Captiva compound would go on for days like that, you know, with people coming in and out. And so we get a really rich portrait of the scene behind the work. And that was one of the things that really stood out to me, is that you could go into a museum and look at a piece, and then you can listen to the oral histories of the people that were actually in the room with him while he was making it. And it just gives you such a different appreciation for what you're actually looking at, because you get, yes, the technical process, but also like the story of the night that a piece of art was made.
Right. And that is can be a very different approach than an art historian who can get granular, or even in terms of the physical object, the kind of how was it actually created. It's interesting because as you're describing your efforts, and even as I read the book, it wasn't really geared towards how something specifically was created.
Right.
You know, I don't know any better how Monogram was put together. There's one combine where there's a great anecdote about someone seeing the stuffed chicken on top, and I'm sorry, I don't know the name of the work, but that almost was, I know you identified in your oral history, but it almost wasn't as important as the story and the lesson that was learned of the person who didn't understand that, and yet she has a hat with feathers and Bob talks to her, and so you become much more enamored with what he was able to accomplish as a personality, and not just the outrage of the work at the time.
Yeah. And I think that it's a really, you know, I think it's an incredible avenue into art appreciation. You know, maybe for people who don't have that already, having all these stories makes the work that much more interesting, right? So it's really, I think it enriches people's experiences of the work, and maybe helps new people to appreciate it in different ways as well.
But I wonder if you would have as good a story if it wasn't Robert Rauschenberg. I mean, if you were to do an oral history of another artist, Don, I don't know what you think about this, but he has such a fascinating background that before he became an artist, and then even after he decides to go to Captiva, leaves New York, he spends 40 years, the better part of his life, in Captiva, although also traveling around the world. But he has such an interesting story, and to make an oral history, it's great to have good stories.
Definitely. But, you know, on the other hand, that's absolutely true. And so when Peter Behrman asked me, you know, do you think there's a book here? Yes, clearly there's a book here, because there are just so many rich stories, you know, stories that go on for days. And as I was telling you when we previously spoke, so many stories that I wasn't able to include in the book, because part of the way that the book is edited, it was my first attempt at the book. I didn't actually make the people speak to each other. I tried something really different, because I'm not an art historian. One of the real joys for me of working on this project was that I really came to understand all of the key players that need to exist around an artist. So yes, you know, the people that he loves and his social environment and his collaborators and the people that are assisting him in the studio, but then also people that are moving that artwork around the world, people that are installing it, people that are curating the shows, people that are then critiquing the shows. So I really came to appreciate all these different pieces that needed to function around him. And so my first attempt at editing it was sort of more chapters with standalone narratives that were organized by those kinds of roles. But it just wasn't creating the same kind of energy that clearly existed around him in his life, right? Where all of those things were overlapping.
And that's what's so remarkable when you look at the people who contributed that you were able to interview. It's people like Calvin Tompkins and Dorothy Lichtenstein and Arnie Glimsher of Pace Gallery, and the artist Lawrence Weiner, artist Donald Saff, artist Hisachika Takahashi, Dickie Landry. Then also thinking about, and John Giorno, Bryce Martin, who is one of his assistants in the studio, and then his own family members. His sister Janet was fascinating to read.
Amazing.
Yeah, and his wife Susan Weil and his son Christopher. And I know in doing what I was able to with research, I didn't have access to those voices as well as you were able to put that together. Did you approach these people differently, or were you ever I mean, did you have to learn to speak differently to different people based on the kind of information you wanted?
Yeah, I think so. But I think that's the work of an oral historian in general, right? I often like to say about oral historians is like, I never consider myself the expert. I'm a generalist, right? So my job is to learn enough that I can have, hopefully smart enough conversations with people who know a million times more than I do, right? And so on a project like this, where you're interviewing people who fulfill such different roles, absolutely the approach is very different. With Janet, who I had the pleasure of interviewing, I got to travel down to Louisiana, and my preparation for that was sitting and visiting with Gina and David and getting a sense from them about some of the trips that she had taken with him and some of the stories that they knew they would love to have as part of the collection. And then we really, we visited, and she is just incredible. I mean, a gifted storyteller, loves to talk and speaks so well. So that was just like, hanging out and just being on the receiving end of her, fun energy. And then for somebody else, like I did a couple of the more technical interviews with the studio assistants or fabricators. That really required me learning a different kind of language. We did that a partnership with the conservator Christina Fronart. She came in, and her and I worked together to sort of create, okay, yes, we want to speak to this person about their own life history, their relationship with Bob, but also then we did this little series of interviews that we called our technical interviews that were on film, that would allow these people who were in the room making the art to speak to more of the technical aspects of how the work was made, so that it could also then be better conserved. And so, that required me to step a little bit further outside of my own comfort zone and learn stuff about making art that
was new to you. I wanted to bring Don into this conversation because you mentioned when we first started that you actually didn't have the pleasure of being able to introduce Don. So obviously, Don, you were part of the project, the pilot project before, and actually helped to determine that this was such a worthwhile project to pursue. Could you tell us when you met Rauschenberg very early, and I believe it was because of your connection with printmaking and paper making that you had contact with Rauschenberg as early as the late 60s. Is that right?
Yeah, it started with our mutual interest in drinking.
Oh, we'll see.
I met him a number of times at the old Cedar Tavern in
New York,
the 60s, and I also happened to be in Italy when he received the gold medal in '64
at the Venice Biennale.
Right, at the Venice Biennale. I was at that time on a Fulbright, but I did meet him at the Cedar Bar. I would watch him as he watched Bill de Kooning and Frank Klein, and listen to Harold Rosenberg and so forth. But I never really did have much of a conversation with him. I was sort of busy marveling at him, marveling at those people. And it was interesting because later on, he was asked whether his work was an invective towards abstract expressionism. I remember him saying that, no, he just had too much respect to repeat their work. And so he was, in a sense, whether that's true or not, what he was a consummate diplomat when he wanted to be. And, he certainly was, he was very fond of those people. Certainly the Erase de Kooning came from the Kooning, which took a lot of work for him to ask and, receive.
And receive a really tough one to erase.
Subsequently, I met him again when Jim Rosenquist came to visit in Tampa and had a horrific accident. He was in the hospital. It was likely that the child and his wife was going to survive. Fortunately, they did come around. They did survive. But while Jim was in the hospital, numerous people from the art world came by. And as I was the host for Jim, I met any number of people that I hadn't met formally. And I did meet Bob Rauschenberg, and he was going to stay overnight. So I invited him out to the university. And unfortunately got lost on the way to the university in my own territory. I was quite embarrassed and said to Bob, "I'm embarrassed. I'm lost." And he said, "If you're lost, you're exactly where you should be." And that was the beginning of my real understanding of what he meant, what he was all about, what his lifestyle was, and what his approach was to the making of art.
Mhm.
He came
And
out, and from that point on, we had worked together. I think that was probably 72 or so, and it was nonstop until he passed.
Right, right. And would you think of your time with him as it was certainly a professional relationship, and it's very it brings a lot of information to the understanding of his work and how it was created through the interviews that are in the book. But it's also, there was a personal relationship, wouldn't you say? To know someone over that period of time. I mean, you knew him basically as long as he lived in Florida, 40 years.
Yes, yeah, and it's a complex relationship, as he had with many people. One could look at it superficially and say he's gregarious, he's wonderful. He was a complex man, and I've sort of analogized him on a couple of occasions to Charles Foster Kane, Orson Welles' Charles Foster Kane. I mean, he had much greater riches than that so-called fictitious character. But he was complex. But when it came to his art, he was not complex. It was straight ahead all the time, and you could spend hours with him, waiting to go to work with him, waiting to ask him for a question, and he would not allow you to ask him. And then 2 o'clock in the morning, you went with him, the dogs, with his handkerchief in his back, colorful handkerchief in his back pocket. Off he went to the studio, and there he worked. And he never minded anybody being with him. He enjoyed people's company. It was sort of like being in the middle of Penn Station. Trains would come and go. You were there. The television set was on. People were walking in, employees, guests, whatever. And he wasn't affected by any of that. I mean, it was all part of the material, the fabric of what he was weaving. I mean, he was just putting that all together. That was all input, whether it was soap opera or a story about Gertrude Stein. I mean, he took it all in and spilled it all out into his art.
I think you said in an earlier conversation with Sarah and me that he knew exactly what was going on in The Young and the Restless. Is that right? You said that?
Oh, not only The Young and the Restless, but Days of Our Lives. And the morning would start off with that every morning. I looked at the mail, and while he the conversations across the room, and while he would talk to me about Matisse or whatever. Generally, he didn't talk about artists too much, but he loved Matisse. In fact, one time I remember being in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow with him, and we turned the corner, and there he saw the
Red Room
of Matisse, and you could see a tear in his eye. And I never saw him react to another artist in that way. I mean, he wouldn't talk about Picasso. He loved Jim Rosenquist, but nobody touched him like a Matisse work.
It's amazing. Since you bring up Russia, I thought maybe we would jump into the program that took him around the world and some of the people he really collaborated with. The Rauschenberg Overseas Cultural Interchange. He felt so strongly about working with art, the power of art around the world, that he embarked on this project and even went to the UN in 1984 to announce the organization. And I just have a definition and a comment he made at the UN. I feel strong in my beliefs based on my varied and widely traveled collaborations that a one-to-one contact through art contains potent, peaceful powers and is the most non-elitist way to share exotic and common information, seducing us into creative, mutual understandings for the benefit of all. But it was interesting to hear, before we get into the depth of China and the impact it had on him to create this. Next image, please. That ROCI also referred to the name of his pet turtle, and you were telling us about this particular performance piece.
Right. It calls Spring Training. I'm not sure whether it was 64 or 65.
Very early, yeah.
I'm not sure what it was. But yes, he, of course, a lot of his performance pieces were designed so that he was not at ease all the time, that he had to work with the cards that were dealt. And
right.
That's the way he dealt with life. That's the way he dealt with his own illness. He played the hand he was dealt.
Right.
And so in this case, he used a large number of turtles in which he strapped a flashlight to their back, and they moved around the stage, and he had to perform and around them,
right.
other objects as well. And it was an interesting, the concept itself, to place
right.
a flashlight, which is emanating something obviously moving at the speed of light on the back of something as slow and ponderous as a turtle.
But I think it's so great.
Dichotomy, which is very typical of Bob.
But it was so great. Next image that he had. I mean, it was his own pet turtle, right? ROCI was.
He kept one, and that was.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's sort of amazing. Then next image, please. That he embarks on this amazing cultural exchange and felt so committed to it that he, I think, had difficulty raising money in order to go around the world. I think, Sarah, in your book, you also talk about how he actually achieved the millions that was really needed in order to do this.
Mm-hmm. Partly selling some of his own work to fund the project.
Yeah, extraordinary. And then
one of the things that happened relative to raising funds, we had decided we were going to ask Philip Morris and another company. We decided not to ask them because we didn't want to push a cigarette selling organization or another organization that sold arms. And so he was busy deciding, what company would fund the tour. And in the end, no money was offered from anyone. And he thought finally that actually that was the best way, because as it was, he was going to be accused of a kind of cultural imperialism as he moved around. This way, he wouldn't be funded by any given organization. Indeed, he charged me with selling some of his best works, Jasper Johns, Andy Warhol's.
Right, and totally.
The best of what he had collected or had been given over the years.
But I think
a lot of his own work as well.
Could we see the next images, the next three images? And this was from this first, basically what was inspiring this cultural exchange, wasn't it? That you went with him on a paper making exploration to China, and he was not able to actually go to the plant. He was kept from it. And that's great to hold it there. That he was 40 miles away from where the paper making was actually going to be, or where the paper making was actually being produced. And because of that story with someone that he was able to then pursue, or wanted to pursue, this idea of creating art that would be available to everyone. Could you tell us what just happened, these images that we see of this is not making paper, this is making dumplings.
Right, well, the way it started basically was Gemini, a publisher in California, was involved with the Maryland Institute of the Arts, and they have a sister city in China, and that sister city houses the world's oldest paper mill, the Yuan paper mill, which made what they call 1,000-year paper, because No chemicals were used to make the pulp. It was bleached in sunlight by draping it over mulberry bushes. And so we were going there to work on a paper project. Well, this was 82. We went, and they were fearful that secrets were going to be stolen from them. And so we had to work at the so-called VIP compound, a distance from the mill, and that they would ferry the project back and forth from the VIP compound to the mill. Well, in the course of doing that, since we were sequestered there, Bob wanted to learn how to make dumplings, jowsers. And so there was a cook who was there day and night and who was incredulous about Bob's work ethic. I remember that. He didn't understand why, if Bob was on his own, he would work so many hours. And, the typical sort of communist concept, you make believe you pay us and we'll make believe we work. And that's their modus operandi. Well, it was a total surprise. And so Bob befriended this cook, wanted to learn how to do the jowsers. The cook taught him. And in the course of being together, Bob would ask him where his family was. And he told him about 25 miles away. Bob asked, when did you see them last? And he said, I haven't seen them for, 10 or 15 years. And that we're not allowed to travel. And so he said, well, they don't know what you're doing. You don't know what they're doing. Correct. Well, at that time, dealer Doug Christmas in California had been urging Bob to do a world tour, but Bob didn't see the meaning of just having an exhibition traveling around the world. I mean, as it is, he was well-traveled.
Right.
And ever curious and wanted to go everywhere and see everything. But all of a sudden he realized that, if you don't know what's going on 25 miles away, how do you know what's going on 2,500 miles away, or 5,000 miles away? And that perhaps by showing what is happening in a given location, another area, another people would begin to understand through the language of art what other people are thinking, feeling, and seeing. So at that point, when we returned to Beijing after being in Jingsheng, the idea had crystallized, and he said, I know what I want to do. I basically, though he didn't say it in those words, I said it, I want to introduce the world to itself, and I'll do it through their material and their imagery, their art, but see it through a different parallax. And of course, that's what he did. He gave them license to see their art differently, as he gave basically every student of art afterwards license to think differently and individually.
Right. And could we just jump to the next three images slowly? You see Bob in China. I guess you said that's you behind Bob.
Yes, this Bob is, photographing.
Right.
And of course, at one point, I think he said, asked him one thing that he was afraid of, and he said he was, because he photographed everything, he said that he was afraid he was going to run out of world. And that was his greatest fear. I mean, he just was insatiable.
Well, how much?
And here he is. He wanted to go to Tibet. I was able to go to Tibet and arrange an exhibition. Amazingly, they knew him. Amazingly, he asked me to bring to the Tibetans some films, and I brought Black Stallion and Dumbo. They loved it. The only thing they requested, they wanted to have a copy of Lost Horizons, the Ronald Coleman version.
Oh, right.
The one request, and a breeding pair of Lhasa Apso dogs, because the Chinese had killed off all their dogs. And Bob tried to send them Lhasa Apsos, but the Chinese would not allow it to be sent.
Right. So at this point,
in that photograph, just to finish that, he was saying, I won't forget you to the Tibetans. And he said, if I have my way, the world won't forget you. And he spent a lot of effort, goodwill, and money to support Tibetan causes and to support the Tibetans from that time forward. And he never stopped. He he realized his commitment.
And that was 1985, the same year he went to Mexico and Chile, Venezuela, China, and Tibet, which is incredible that he did that in 1 year, it seems. Here, I know you included this image, a photograph Rauschenberg took, and then how he incorporated it into the artwork up above, and you see it on the right-hand side.
Two things were happening at the same time. The development of the paper project, which used paper pulp, the thinnest paper you could find, the Juan paper, but then he built it up to the thickest paper. So it's a combination of all exploiting every possibility of paper making in the development of the project. And here, at the same time, he was photographing as much as he could, and ended up doing 100-foot-long continuous photo based on the Chinese scrolls that he began to see and study and understand.
So we'll see those in the next images. I think the next image is one of the paper pieces he created on his first trip to China.
You can see this paper. You can see through it. He was also fascinated by the ubiquitous Chinese poster, which was everywhere. And that's such a sort of democratic thing for Bob to be something everybody had.
Right, the familiar.
Right.
And then we could just look at the next images that you related to Tibet, I guess, as well.
Yeah. The bowl, the bronze vase. We had met a Tibetan monk who showed us that if you rub your finger along the top, like we all do on, to make that sound on crystal wine glasses, that the water would shoot up exactly where the cast fish were on the outside. So there are actually cast bubbles on the inside in the bronze, and this water would come up exactly like that. And in Tibet, and so he made a work called Tibetan Garden Song, which placed the cello inside a typical wash basin, and
the next image. Yeah.
And titled it Tibetan Garden Song. And basically it was a development out of seeing that bowl.
Right.
The brush that's hanging there is a scroll maker's brush. And so, and the cellos, by the way, were made in China.
Wow, incredible.
And then cellos,
And then going forward to the scroll and the interior shot, this lengthy idea of left to right and a sequence that you said inspired this particular work.
Right.
And I'm curious about this. Was this one of his exhibitions, this major exhibition of the ROCI material?
I think this is at the National Gallery, which was the last exhibition. That was to have the show.
Right.
At the National Gallery, yeah.
And I thought, Sarah, your interview with Jack Cowart, who was a curator at the National Gallery at that time, I think there was some conversation, if I remember, we were trying to sort this out. The ROCI project took him so many places that were maybe economically depressed, that were, some concept that Jack had of it being an opportunity for an exchange with artists of the area. Is that right? And then the understanding of what actually happened for this presentation at the National Gallery in Washington.
Yeah, what I remember, part of the editing of that chapter, Dawn, I don't know if you've seen it, is really putting you in conversation with Jack Cowart. And that was a really fun part of the book to work on. And I think the discussion was, when this project was initially conceived, it's what I remember hearing from Jack is that there was some idea that perhaps some of the art making would happen in these destination countries. Right. Rauschenberg would go to these places and be inspired by the people and the culture and the materials, and then also stay and make some of that work there. But in reality, what happened is he traveled and he was inspired and he was engaged with people, but then he returned to Captiva and made the work in Captiva.
Well, for the most part, that's true, because the logistics was so difficult and getting material took a while. Copper from Chile and lapis lazuli and so forth. They were just objects that took a while to get, and so it was not practical. But he did spend endless hours with artists and with students, and sometimes it was very difficult because it was questionable to them why he was there. Was he really trying to do an exchange, or was this just an American exhibition? It was uphill, but he took it on, and if he had
persisted, yeah,
with them in the museum, he would. And if he had to go to the local pub, he would do that. He was indefatigable that way. And yes, the theory was, maybe there would be, as Jack thought, artists would be exhibited at the same time. But you have to realize that Rauschenberg also had a motive of taking apart a long-held tradition at the National Gallery, our National Gallery, which precluded having an exhibition, a solo exhibition of any living artist. And I mean, initially it was a good idea because every senator would want their favorite nephew or niece to have an exhibition. To exclude that, they had that rule. But as the National Gallery grew and the curators matured and the directors matured into that position, it was clear that they would not allow that to happen. But as yet, there was no one-person show. And so we wanted this to be the first one-person living artist exhibition to accomplish yet another goal. Okay.
Right. And we'll just look through the rest of these images from China with the yellow umbrella showing the people following him around. And then the next image of him working with some of the posters, which led to the following artwork in the next image, where he incorporates what he was just working on in this particular. Do you know where this piece is now? Don, do you remember where it went to after? Not necessarily.
I think they still own this work. The foundation, I think, still has it.
Oh, great. So amazing and integral. And then I think we have one great image at the end. And
my favorite image, because it sums him up. I mean, he loved his dogs. He loved the people around him. But he always had a dog present. His first dog that I remember seeing when he was making the early collages and silkscreen paintings was a dog by the name Leica, and he named the road in Florida after his beloved dog, which was much the consternation of the neighbors having their road named after a dog. That was his affection, and this is so typical. Bob would be surrounded by his dogs, his handkerchief in his back pocket, as I said earlier, and off to work with them all.
And could we just be brought back together on the screen? I thought we would just, I know our time's already running quickly away, but I wanted to just talk a little bit about his legacy in those very late years, again, Sarah, that you handled so beautifully in the book. When there was a retrospective recently in 2017 or 2018, I guess, Philip Kennicott in the Washington Post wrote, Rauschenberg died in 2008. He is a beloved figure whose vast legacy, if carefully cherry-picked, can provide inspiration to almost any contemporary artist. He had his conceptual twists, collaborative enterprises, engaged in performance, media ventures, and international outreach, and never entirely forsook making two-dimensional images you can hang on the wall. If American artists are meant to be restless, visionary, boldly transgressive, and gleefully high-spirited, then Rauschenberg is the quintessential American artist. And I thought that is a wonderful summary that the book produces, but also from your relationship, Don, that you're telling us about. I think those comments regarding the motivation behind ROCI and going to these different locations, again, I appreciated in the book, Sarah, that it wasn't the art historical critique. We're aware of some of the charges of imperialism, but you were able to bring it to life in a different way.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, with respect to ROCI in particular, you were talking about how the intentions were initially to be more collaborative, but there was there still was a kind of reciprocity that took place with the way that the show culminated in the United States, but along the way, it became this sort of traveling circus, right, where he would make work in one country, and then the next country that he was so then he would go to one country to do research, go back to Captiva, make the work inspired from there, and then the next country that he would go to, they would bring that work to show. And there are some really lovely stories of the enthusiasm for that work internationally, but also Janet, his sister, speaks to just sitting in rooms around the world watching children see art from different parts of the world, and the way that she perceives them to really be able to see humanity in a new way, and learn about other parts of the world through the work that Rauschenberg is traveling with.
He never sold any of the works he did during ROCI. He did give one to each of the countries he went to, plus one from each country to the National Gallery. And the purpose of that was to get diplomats from those countries together with each country visited and have them at an opening at the National Gallery so they could meet each other informally. And by so doing, maybe have a beginning of a positive liaison. Bob didn't think his ROCI project would bring peace in our time, but he sure thought it could make a difference. And, the postscript to some of this is some of the people I've met. I've been on a conference video conference with people in Cuba who had been there at the opening. I had met a teacher who was at Nanjing University when the exhibition took place, and related that the faculty was told that they could not go to Beijing to the opening, though they were invited. And the way they handled it is that that they would be fired if they did. That the entire faculty got together and said they were going. So as a group, they could not be fired. And from that point on, in terms of the show in Beijing and Tibet, art was referred to there as art before Rauschenberg and art after Rauschenberg. That was the literal impact. And scholars who've gone there realize the difference it made. The difference for a traditional artist in China to see his imagery exploited, used, enhanced through Bob's particular point of view was a very freeing experience, and gave them, as I said earlier, license.
Right.
And of course, it gave Bob all this material that he wanted. And for Bob, it was abundance.
Right.
That was it was abundance that was the mother of invention, not necessity.
But also that really kept him going right up to the very end, when he suffered a stroke and was still making work until he finally decided it's enough. But he was I remember seeing some of the late work, and still the photo transfers. It was rather poignant, and I think Sarah, you handled that beautifully. Donald, you were there practically with him, it sounds like, around the time of the stroke.
Yeah.
And it's an extraordinary legacy, it seems. I'm not sure what your takeaways are. I found with this exhibit, he was truly ahead of his time. The idea of using materials we see with, artists today, the idea of a social practice with other people, collaboration. All of the arts are legitimate. You're not siloed by what you're making, and the sense of it's a global community. And that was just inherent for him. That was it. And it's not something that I think we realized when people started that critique of later work. What do you believe his legacy is, Sarah? Since you're new to Rauschenberg, what is your takeaway of who he was?
I think, the first thing that I heard about him was the famous quote, that there isn't that separation between art and life, right? And at this point, it becomes very cliche to say that, but I think everything that we've shared this evening really does support that. you know, that, and all the stories that I've heard speaking to all of the narrators, is that everything that he lived ends up in his work, you know, whether it's the use of images, whether it's people, you know, he invited so many people into the studio with him, and Anne LaVey, who was a wonderful interview as well, who spent time with him for many years. She talked about being in the studio, and he was just so open, you know, like, oh, what do you think of this color, you know? And so there are so many people that are in his life or end up in the work. And I think that's my greatest takeaway. And it's kind of resulted in me becoming much more of a fan than I was. You know, when I first started to research and I was looking through the work, having all these stories now, it just makes the experience of looking at the work so much richer.
Yeah.
And the heritage is the work that's hanging on your wall. And whether Bob was any kind of personality, whatever kind of personality he might have been, whatever colorful stories you can tell, the fact is that what he left us is what's hanging on the walls of your museum right now. And just that alone is sufficient. It's a wonderful gift he's bequeathed us. And I used to think, I wish I could have been alive to be around Titian. I'd have so many questions. I wish I could have been around Picasso. And then I began to realize more and more that I was around Bob Rauschenberg, and that was just as important. He was a remarkable, remarkable man, but his art is even more remarkable.
Well, I want to thank both of you with this wonderful, almost reminiscing about an extraordinary artist who is still influencing art and the way we behave in the world to each other today. He was certainly with someone that we can learn from, and going forward, that art remains powerful in bringing people together. And I love that there was no hierarchy. It was for everybody, and it was from everything. So thank you again, Sara Sinclair and Don Saff. The book is wonderful. People, even if you didn't know Rauschenberg, you would love the read. That this book is an extraordinary effort putting it together.
Thank you.
Having this real life experience with the artist has been so remarkably special for us. Thank you very much. And I think, Glenn, we're thanking you as well for hosting this tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You brought so many insights to light and just shared remarkable stories. We all know Robert Rauschenberg just a little bit better thanks to you tonight. We appreciate it so much, Sara and Don, and of course, Cheryl.
Thank you.
I wanted to let everybody know just before we sign off tonight that the Norton Museum of Art has two remarkable objects in our Chinese collection that feature the legendary Chinese heroine Mulan. And though most of us learned first about Mulan through Disney, she is in fact a Chinese legend going back hundreds and hundreds of years. I hope you'll join us again next Friday at 7 p.m. when we'll be joined by Laurie Barnes, McGraw Curator of Chinese Art, and Joy Lidu Yi, Associate Professor and Curator of Chinese Art and Archaeology at Florida International University. They will be together to talk about Mulan, the history of a legend. That will be again next Friday night at 7 p.m. You can register for that program and many others at norton.org. Please check us out online. But remember that next Friday, we will open again to the general public. We look forward to seeing you next Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and succeeding weeks on Fridays and through the weekend. Thanks again for joining us at Art After Dark. Have a wonderful weekend. Good night.